The convergence of financial, geopolitical, and infrastructural signals emerging from Iraq and Syria in this period represents one of the most consequential and underappreciated economic realignment stories in the modern Middle East. At the core of this transformation is a dual-track currency reform initiative, unfolding simultaneously in both nations, each reinforcing the other's trajectory toward global financial reintegration. Iraq's Digital Dinar initiative, framed within ISO 2022 compliance standards, is not merely a technical banking upgrade, it is a sovereign declaration of intent. By aligning its currency architecture with internationally recognized digital payment frameworks, Iraq is positioning the dinar for something far more significant than domestic modernization. It is laying the foundational infrastructure for a managed real effective exchange rate, REER, adjustment, one that would allow the currency's true purchasing power to be expressed in global markets without the volatility that has historically undermined investor confidence. A REER tie-in of this nature, when paired with diversified inflows and adequately padded foreign currency reserves, signals to institutional gatekeepers, the IMF, World Bank, sovereign wealth funds, and multinational investors that Iraq is not operating from a position of desperation, but from one of deliberate, sequenced financial engineering. What makes this moment particularly striking is the backdrop against which these developments are occurring. Iraq is not operating in peacetime. Conflict, proxy pressure, and regional instability continue to characterize the environment, yet the Central Bank of Iraq and its government counterparts are pressing forward with structural reforms that most post-conflict nations would defer by years, if not decades. This resilience is not incidental, it is a message. When a nation demonstrates the capacity to advance monetary reform, pursue ISO-compliant digital currency frameworks, and maintain oil output discipline during active regional tensions, it reframes the risk calculus for every serious investor. Watching from London, Dubai, Singapore, or New York, stability is not the absence of conflict. Stability, in investment terms, is the demonstrated ability to maintain institutional function and forward momentum even when conflict is present. Iraq is currently making that case in real time, and the market will eventually price it accordingly. The reopening of the Cyan pipeline and the projected restoration of full operational capacity ranging between 1 and 2 million barrels per day injects a powerful material dimension into what might otherwise remain an abstract monetary story. Oil revenues are the oxygen of Iraq's fiscal system. When pipeline capacity is constrained, reserve accumulation slows, budget execution suffers, and the government's ability to sustain reform momentum is compromised. The restoration of reliable Cyan flow, therefore, does more than add export volume. It directly underwrites the credibility of Iraq's REER management strategy. Higher and more predictable oil revenues expand the central bank's capacity to defend exchange rate targets, absorb speculative pressure, and demonstrate the kind of reserve adequacy that rating agencies and correspondent banks require before restoring full access to the global financial system. Crucially, it also diversifies the inflow structure in ways that reduce dependence on any single revenue pathway, providing the macroeconomic buffer without which a managed currency adjustment would carry unacceptable risk. The fact that this capacity is being restored even during a period of mid-conflict operations is precisely what makes it so significant. It tells the world that Iraq's energy infrastructure is more resilient than its political optics suggest, and that the country's role as a reliable hydrocarbon supplier is not contingent on perfect security conditions. Across the border, the Central Bank of Syria's announcement regarding its Federal Reserve account activation represents a parallel but equally historic development. The The confirmation by Governor Abdul Qadir al-Hasriya that Syria's account at the U.S. Federal Reserve is now operational, and that its activation was met with direct affirmation from the U.S. Treasury and the presidential envoy, is a watershed moment in the country's long road back to correspondent banking access. To understand the significance of this, one must appreciate how thoroughly Syria was cut off from the global financial architecture during the conflict years. Without a functioning correspondent banking relationship, Syrian institutions could not clear dollar-denominated transactions, could not access international trade finance, and could not receive foreign investment through legitimate banking channels. The reactivation of this Federal Reserve account effectively reopens the door to the entire dollar-clearing ecosystem, allowing Syrian banks to once again participate in SWIFT-mediated international transfers, and restoring the plumbing through which economic reconstruction financing must eventually flow. The U.S. Treasury's characterization of this as historic is not diplomatic hyperbole. It reflects an understanding that Syria's return to the correspondent banking system is a prerequisite for any serious reconstruction investment, and that the United States is now prepared to serve as a facilitating power in that process, rather than an obstacle. The concurrent currency replacement program, with approximately 40% of the 42 trillion-old Syrian pound circulation already exchanged for the new currency, reinforces the seriousness of this reintegration effort. A currency replacement of this scale, conducted in a post-conflict environment with significant infrastructure damage and displaced populations, is operationally formidable. The central bank's acknowledgement that the pace will accelerate following Eid al-Fitr suggests both logistical planning and an awareness that the window for smooth transition is time-sensitive. Every percentage point of old currency replaced is a reduction in the informal, shadow economy liquidity that has historically fueled corruption, sanctions evasion, and illicit finance in post-conflict states. In this respect, the currency replacement is simultaneously a monetary reform and a governance reform. It pulls economic activity back into the formal, trackable, taxable system, which is the foundation upon which any sustainable reconstruction economy must be built. The political dimension of all of this cannot be separated from the financial one. The Trump administration's active engagement with both the Iraqi and Syrian reform processes, expressed through Treasury Department welcomes, presidential envoy statements, and the broader diplomatic architecture of U.S. re-engagement with the region, provides a geopolitical umbrella under which these financial reforms gain both credibility and momentum. American political validation, particularly from an administration perceived as transactional and results-oriented, signals to institutional investors that the risk environment is shifting. When the U.S. Treasury publicly affirms Syria's Federal Reserve account reactivation, and when used diplomatic channels are used to communicate expectations around Iraqi monetary reform, it effectively reduces the political risk premium that has kept Syria's capital on the sidelines. The reference to Iraq's repeated public denials of any imminent rate change, and the countervailing suggestion that presidential-level communication with Iraqi leadership may be pushing in a different direction, adds a layer of intrigue that sophisticated observers of Iraqi monetary policy will recognize as meaningful. Central bankers rarely telegraph rate changes. They often deny them until the moment of action. The pattern of public denial combined with structural preparation is a familiar prelude. The Iranian dimension remains the critical variable. The geopolitical architecture that has kept American companies from engaging Iraq at the scale needed for genuine economic reconstruction is inseparable from Iranian proxy influence over Iraqi political and security institutions. The current Exposure and confrontation of these Iranian entanglements, however disruptive in the short term, is a necessary precondition for the deeper U.S.-Iraq economic partnership that currency reform, oil infrastructure restoration, and digital financial integration are all pointing toward. Trump's approach, whatever one's political assessment of it, is operationally coherent in this respect. Security normalization must precede large-scale investment, and large-scale investment is what gives currency reform its economic substance. A revalued dinar in a country where American firms cannot safely operate is a financial instrument without an economic engine. The sequencing matters enormously, and the current pressure on Iranian influence networks in Iraq, combined with Syria's reintegration into dollar clearing systems, suggests that sequencing is now being actively managed at the highest levels of U.S. foreign policy. Taken together, these developments: digital dinar architecture, ISO compliance, Cyan pipeline restoration, Federal Reserve account reactivation, currency replacement in Syria, and active U.S. diplomatic engagement across both nations, constitute a mosaic that points in a single, coherent direction: the deliberate, U.S.-supported reconstruction of the Middle East's financial and economic infrastructure, with Iraq and Syria as the twin anchors of that project. For investors who have been watching and waiting, the question is no longer whether this transformation is coming. The question is whether they will be positioned when it arrives.